Ce dernier panel porte sur justement le passage, la traduction des principes éthiques en normes et en lois internationales, ou en tout cas en cadre de régulation internationaux. Je voudrais dire un mot de circonstance tout d'abord. Je vais le dire en français, parce que le panel sera en anglais, mais je vais le dire en français. Je voudrais honorer aujourd'hui la mémoire de Nadine Giraud, qui était la ministre des Relations internationales et de la francophonie du Québec et qui est décédée récemment. Je tiens à lui rendre hommage. Elle a été d'un appui constant pour le développement de l'écosystème québécois de l'IA à l'échelle internationale, et surtout, elle a été d'un soutien constant pour la sensibilisation à l'échelle internationale de l'IA dite responsable, ou en tout cas des enjeux de déploiement de l'IA. Elle a soutenu par exemple la délibération que nous avons organisée pour l'UNESCO en 2021 et qui a permis de nourrir la recommandation de l'UNESCO sur l'éthique de l'IA. Donc voilà, je voulais en dire un mot. Je remercie David. Thank you, David, for joining us. Now I would like to introduce very briefly this panel. So the increasing pace of the development and deployment of AI systems with deep learning techniques has first led to fears of application mainly oriented towards military intervention and social control, and also fears of a loss of control of these systems. In the computer science community, especially, this fear has translated into the adoption of guiding ethical frameworks as the ILOMA principles in 2017, and also the Montreal Declaration in 2017-2018. So this first conversation about ethical AI has raised a global awareness of the social and societal challenges of an uncontrolled deployment of AI, and prepared the elaboration of several national and international ethical frameworks. For instance, the European Commission in 2018, the OECD in 2020, UNESCO and the Council of Europe in 2021. But after this moment of elaboration of ground ethical declarations at the international level, well, comes the moment of reflection on their applications in a multi-modal regulation framework. So Catherine Régis, Jason Millar, and David Leslie will help us better understand the challenges we face in implementing these ethical principles and recommendations in other normative orders, spheres, in particular that of international regulation and engineering standards. So let me introduce very briefly our panelists. Catherine Régis is professor of law at the University of Montreal. She holds Canada Research Chair in Health, Law and Policy, and co-chairs the Responsible AI Working Group for the Global Partnership on AI. Jason Millar holds the Canada Research Chair in Ethical Engineering of Robotics and AI, and is professor at the University of Ottawa's School of Engineering Design and Teaching Innovation. And David Leslie is, well, he is Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute and Professor of Ethics, Technology and Society at Queen's Mary University of London. So, straight to the point. We don't have time to, a longer introduction. My first question for all of you is, well, we've we've been talking about ethics and how ethics is limited or sometimes pointless. Okay, I would like to re-explore this question with you. How do you view the importance of the global conversation on AI ethics over the 5 or 4 past years in regulating the development, deployment, and use of AI? So what is the importance of this kind of, stance, the ethical stance? Catherine?
Okay, yeah. So you're all looking at me. So first of all, hi, everybody. I think you're very courageous to still be here. I know we are between your drinks and so the fun part, so hopefully it's going to be interesting. So I just want to say that the global conversation for me is a really essential one, but it's also not an easy one. And I think the global conversation, international conversation that we have had over the last few years help us to realize that national approaches are limited in scope and impact and do not address the need to define global norms to govern AI in a context where risk and benefits go well beyond domestic borders. So no country alone can successfully address the impact of AI that AI can have on security, democracy, social justice, and so on. So I think this conversation has helped to recognize that states are interdependent in that AI project to govern properly AI, and also that they are vulnerable, and that's an important point, I think. Why? So that's the part about why it's important, but about the challenge to have this global conversation. So for being part of this conversation, at least to a certain level, with the GPA, for instance, that you mentioned, Marc-Antoine, I see that despite the complexity of the global conversation, there are really significant efforts that are being made to try to have these conversations. So that, no doubt about that, and I think that's very positive. But one challenge is it's difficult to find common grounds and pathway, including at their normative level when you have these conversations. And that's because there's a variety of interests at stake. Obviously, you have economical, political, cultural, and even disciplines don't have the same language and don't have the same values sometimes. So imagine it's difficult at the local level. It's 10 times more difficult at the international level to really find common grounds for these variety of interests when they are at stake. But it's not because it's difficult that we should not do it. And there are concrete examples of a global conversation that was successful. I think the UNESCO recommendation that was adopted recently is a good illustration, but also some GPA projects that I will speak about later are also a good example. And this is also why I found that in that international space and global conversation, human rights frameworks are really important. And just taking the example of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, they are essential to rely on to discuss AI. They represent an essential point of anchor to give common direction, values, and responsibilities. And it's important to remind countries that they have pretty much all agreed to do this. So it really gives you an anchor and a basic to have a common language and common targets when you have these conversations. So they play a unique role and they deserve our full support to make sure that AI, that human rights are central to the conversation.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. I will hand over to David. So please, David.
Sure, thank you. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, I think really the question is trying to scratch this itch of thinking about how the ethics side connects with the legal side, or how where the rubber hits the road in terms of the normativity in connecting with the regulation. And I think it's a really difficult question in a sense, but one that's very, I think, natural to the way we ask questions about legitimacy in the modern legal age, which is to say, I think that when we think of the legitimacy of the law, we aren't just thinking about the power of the law, we're thinking about the consent of the governed in agreeing to be bound by the law. And it's in where I see the point of entry for the normative side of things is in that element where we see the validity of the law. And so to go back to the question, I think that the last few years, as far as I see it, have really been about preparing, if you will, a kind of normative underpinning for there to be kind of an actionable translation of principles into practice through standards, regulation, governance regimes. And so I do think that there's been progress made in that, and that if we see it in an evolutionary way, we can see that whereas we started, a few years ago with, literally dozens of different ethics sort of frameworks for AI, I think we are kind of moving towards a more hard and fast direction when it comes to thinking about operationalizing those of the principles that have converged into more acceptable standards and elements of potential regulation. Now, that being said, I'll quickly also say one deficit that I've really seen over the past few years is it all started with human rights thinkers criticizing AI thinkers as sort of distracting us from the real kind of hard-nosed, way that we could, press fundamental rights and freedoms into the service of governing the technology. And I think that tension was a bit of a false one, because the ethics is always, in a sense, at play when we think of human rights, sort of giving us perspective on rights, allowing us to articulate the normative foundation of rights and whatnot. But the one thing that's missed, I think, in that conversation between mainstream AI ethics and human rights, and I think this is changing now, but it's been that we really need to pay attention to non-Western, non-conventionally considered to be in the human right discourse thinking. And I think the UNESCO recommendation starts to do that. I think it sort of brings in some additional values that move beyond just the human rights frame and the ethics frame. But I would point out that we are on a journey where what started in a very global northerly and Western-centric view of ethics, AI ethics, and human rights basis is now, in a sense, adjusting itself to the more pluralistic character of this global conversation.
Thank you, David. So Jason.
Great, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is just it's been a great listening into some of the conversations today, and I'm happy to be up here in such great company. I think when I was thinking about this question when you sent it to us, I can't help but reflect on how quickly this conversation has evolved in the last 10 years or so. And I think some framing is important, because what we're talking about is norm setting and norm shifting in policy, in engineering practice, in computer science practice. And I think what I'll focus on in my comments a little bit more is the engineering side, the computer science side. It's the side that, well, maybe I can just add my own flavor to. But it was when I started my PhD. I'm going to tell a little story here. When I started my PhD, 2008, 2009, 2010, there was I was interested in doing work on robot ethics, right? In the philosophy department. I couldn't find a supervisor. Nobody understood why I was interested in this topic. It just wasn't something that was on anyone's mind. And if you fast forward through, 2012, 2015, we're starting to see conferences emerge. The topics are coming up in the media. There's this kind of explosion around 2014, 2015 of public awareness of certain topics like driverless vehicles. And the kind of existential threat of AI starts becoming a thing. You hear Elon Musk and Bill Gates talking about these things, and so really we're talking about organizations that have been set up to support this work, research agendas that have come out of nowhere in the past 5-6 years. So to really be focusing on what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is you're looking at almost, I would say, 2/3 of the history of this contemporary discussion of what the norms and like what norms should be emerging around ethics and AI. And so I look at the work that we're doing as a kind of a marathon. Norm setting takes time. If you look at, changing norms in practice professions like engineering, other professions that are still relatively new, like computer science and the kind of modern version of AI. This is a big job. So I guess I'm an optimist. I'm saying I'm an optimist when it comes to kind of looking back and seeing all this movement in policy, like governments all over the world, declaring principles, like, making noise about how important it is to do this. I don't know that there are other issues that are as easy to, to point to and say we've seen so much, at least initial movement in the field. And I of course, I completely agree with the comments of the other panelists that these things need to move forward. We need to move faster. We need to catch up to technology. But where the question is, what do I think about is the conversation around ethics useful? Is it a good conversation? It's the conversation that has us here today, speaking about these topics. So I'm optimistic. The challenge, of course, is the norms, right? The norm setting. How do we move? Ethicists are, we kind of do the business of realizing what normative positions we want to take and making arguments and trying to convince other people. And then, we try to convince policymakers. We try to, impact policy where we're doing applied work. That's if we're doing applied work. Policymakers need to, and legal scholars need to decide what kind of norms they want to set. And then, of course, that last mile problem, getting it into practice, which is where I think a lot of us are pointing to and saying, how can we get that work done? Is it standards? Is it codes of ethics? What is it? What more do we need? We need tools. What is it? That's a difficult conversation. I guess we can talk a little bit more about in the other questions, but I'm optimistic. I think that it's amazing to see what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. And so it's a good start for whatever the hard work that needs to come.
Yeah, it's a good start, and we already are moving pretty fast, changing the practices and adopting really quickly new norms in technology. A previous speaker asked, why would we need ethics if we have law? And my question is quite the reverse. Why would we need anything other than ethics? So, is it sufficient to to mitigate risks and of misuse and maybe mitigate harm? What are the main limitation for you of AI ethics? But do we need anything other than ethics? Jason, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, so this is a great question, right? Because there's, I think both of you, David and Catherine, you are with the Global Partnership on AI. The reason I stumble on that is because I represent in part, one of the roles that I have is at the partnership on AI, so which is a different one, and we work a lot with stakeholders and partners that are in industry and also other organizations, but really when I look at other ethics issues that have made their way into practice in the private sector, privacy is one of them, right? For all the movement that we still need in privacy, we have laws. We have at least when you walk into a company and talk about privacy, they'll call the lawyers, and the lawyers have things to say about privacy, and they can draw lines in the sand and tell you what you can and can't do. But of course, then there's this other set of questions about what you should be doing in addition to the bare minimum that the law is going to demand that you do. And this is where the ethics conversation comes in, right? So a lot of the work I do is obviously as an academic at a university and teaching in an engineering faculty is trying to bring ethics to folks like young students who I know are going to go off and develop these technologies in corporations where when the ethics questions come up, the lawyers come in, and then it's like, what are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? Like, this is a typical question in the room, right, with when you're at the company. And I'm trying to do this norm setting in the world where, and I think this is where the ethics comes in, where it's like, what more do we need to do? And, because a lot of that stuff, it's not going to make sense to create laws to prevent us from doing things. It would be cumbersome and overbearing, right, from the law's perspective. So the conversation around ethics is the conversation that gets us beyond the worst of what we can do, right? Like, which is what the law is trying to, as I understand it, trying to protect us from. And so it's critical, right? But we need to have that conversation in a way that translates well into engineering and technology domains. Just like when we talk to policymakers, we have to have the conversation in a way that translates into policy language, right? So that so that people who do ethics and policy work can like help develop the tools for policymakers. And I think we're very early in that process of getting, of having that ethics conversation, which is critical, in contexts where we have technologists who are working in their own world of norms and of practice and of rules and laws. And so that's really, I think, one of the key areas that we need to focus on. And it's an area that I focus on in my research, and certainly at Partnership on AI, a lot of what we do is try to develop the language and tools that you can take to translate those norms into practice. But it's a slow-going effort because there are so many missing pieces currently, right? Going into companies and trying to do that is tough. We don't have those programs. Well, we're getting those programs set up at the academic institutions. We're building the education programs, but it's going to take a long time, I think, to do that. But that's a critical piece of, and it's why ethics is important and where you should put the ethics focus, I think.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, I would say I would take a hard stance on this one and say that ethics is necessary but not sufficient. To answer the question, we need oversight. We need proper regulatory control so that the tendencies towards virtue signaling and ethics washing that do exist can be addressed at the right level. So, I think I'll offer one example that's just come up that I think we're all kind of thinking about these days, and that's OpenAI and OpenAI's ChatGPT and the way that they've released this technology into the world. And it's really interesting if you go onto the OpenAI website to the release page for this, for all the GPT series of large language models, you'll notice that it's linked to their OpenAI founding charter. And in the founding charter, it says, OpenAI declares its commitment to avoid enabling uses of AI that harm humanity or unduly concentrate power. And they claim that OpenAI's primary fiduciary duty is to humanity. And yet, if you step back and you see how there is, in a sense, a kind of move fast and break things attitude that still exists and now exists with actions that are being with types of technologies that have an at-scale consequence to them, affecting literally hundreds of millions of people, it should give us pause to say, should we leave this to the potential ethical rhetoric or false rhetoric of an organization such as OpenAI? And so I tend to think that we do, it's important to stress that ethics is itself important, but it's also important to stress that that the interests that drive the AI ecosystem aren't necessarily the public interest. And when you've got impacts that affect the public interest, you need to regulate those who are going to have those impacts and oversee their activity.
Yeah, thank you, David. So ethics is maybe the other name for loose self-regulation when your interest is at stake. Catherine?
Yes, so my answer is pretty much in line with what David just mentioned. So ethics is important, but it's not sufficient. And I'm not even sure that it's useful to really say one or the other. I think they are all part of the normative basket that we have at our disposition to regulate AI. And we have standards, we have ethics, we have law, and they do different things. So it's really important to have that capacity to zoom out and really try to think about norms with all their complexity and where they are more useful depending on the phenomenon we try to regulate. So ethics, again, important. I mean, I was part of the Montreal Declaration, so I believe in ethics for sure. I'm not an ethicist, I'm a legal scholar, but I think ethics, for me, allow for more reflexivity, I think that's the word, and probably more rapid adaptation that binding frameworks would be able to provide. But they are not sufficient, and I think that comes back to the point made by David, because we cannot enforce ethics norms in a context where dynamics of power are really strong in AI. So we need to have that extra muscle that sometimes the legal context can give us. And also I think that legislation, and we are moving towards legislation, specific legislation in AI, I think it's very important to do, and we should continue in that direction, but they also create stronger predictability for AI developers and AI businesses. So to really know what's going to be the expectation and the sanctions is actually contrary to what we often hear, not something that refrain innovation, but something that can help to have good innovation when you know exactly your terrain de jeu, right, your playground. Someone told me recently, and I think that's kind of provocative, that soft laws are norms without money. So I think it's overstated, but there's still something true in that phrase. So we need that, again, extra muscle. Also I would like to say that when something is formulated in terms of rights, and I would like to hear what you have to say about that, Marc-Antoine, for sure. I think it gives an additional tools in everybody's toolbox where you can ask a behavior to stop. So you have that card in your game, and we know political philosopher that use that expression. So it gives extra leverage, and at the end of the day, having these rights, even it's complex and many circumstances to really enforce and use them, it also contributes to empower people in ways that maybe ethics couldn't do. So.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, you're not only experts in your own field, you're also kind of practitioner. And I would like to know how precisely you work to implement or translate ethical principles into norms, different kinds of norms, such as standards. So maybe, David, you could answer well, or give us the flavor of your work. I know, as director of ethics at the Alan Turing Institute, you are currently working on the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics. So can you give us a brief overview of your work?
Sure. I mean, I would love to start with the UNESCO recommendation. So, as many of you know, in November of 2021, this was adopted by all of UNESCO's member states, which was quite a windfall when we think of the way in which the scope of that buy-in to the ethics recommendation was unprecedented. And if you look at the recommendation itself, what's interesting, I mentioned this before, but in that recommendation, there is a kind of widening of the lens of normativity. So there's a value, for instance, on living in, I think it's peaceful, interconnected, and just societies that starts from a very relational point of view. And there's other references to sort of more biospheric rights and or orientation to to environmental sustainability, which comes through very strong in the UNESCO recommendation. Well, right after it was adopted in late 2021, now we're going into early 2022, it really started to gain traction and steam. And since that early time now, it's gone from sort of spurring interest in a handful of UNESCO member states to now literally dozens of member states seeking to be early adopters of the policy actions that attend the recommendation, right? So the recommendation has values, it has principles, and it has policy actions. And as part of the operationalization of the recommendation now, I'm on the high-level expert group that's handling this, and we're really working with UNESCO to figure out what are the best starting points for that operationalization. And the two things that we've been working on are first the ethical impact assessment, which is really it'll be an instrument that seeks a kind of ex-ante approach, so an anticipatory approach to stemming potential adverse impacts in design time, so that the potential harms can be avoided rather than sort of mitigated retrospectively. And there's the second action or instrument that UNESCO is developing called the readiness assessment methodology, which is really intended to provide the governments of member states with a lens into the where they are in the journey towards being able to implement the recommendation, right? Because it's a complex range of capabilities and levels of readiness that needs to be involved in really being able to carry out, in order to cultivate a responsible AI ecosystem. And we're talking at the sociocultural level, at the economic level, there's a broad range of domains that need to be prepared in order for the ecosystem itself to function responsibly. And so the readiness assessment methodology is really kind of in sort of intending to sort of help the governments of the member states address where they might have weaknesses. And I'll quickly mention, aside from UNESCO, the past few years, I authored the UK's National Guidance on AI Ethics and Safety for the Public Sector. And that work really developed into a more international perspective. And we worked with, my team at the Turing worked with, for instance, GPay on this project on advancing data justice research and practice, in which we also sort of developed some practical guidance and practical norms for instituting responsible innovation in the context of datafication and digitization. And then the other project I'll mention that I've been working on with my team is the Council of Europe is at the moment sort of building out a convention that will align artificial intelligence, so the design, development, and deployment of artificial intelligence with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And in order for that to happen in a practical way, there needs to be what they're calling a HUDIRIA, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law impact assessment. And my teams are working closely with the Secretariat to flesh out what that looks like in terms of things like stakeholder engagement and preliminary context-based risk analysis, formulating mitigation plans for identified adverse impacts on rights and freedoms, and things like that. So there's a lot going on. And I think, it's nice to see that there's a kind of a common momentum among a lot of different international organizations.
Thank you. Thank you, David. We're looking forward to the release of the final product, definitely. Catherine, so David mentioned impact assessment as a tool. Is that the kind of tool GPay is considering developing or other tools. So what is the mission? Yeah. Of GPay.
Good timing.
It's perfect.
Wow.
Perfect timing. So please.
Okay, so just a few words about GPay. So I'm not sure everybody knows about this organization. So it has been created a couple of years ago, so it's still really young. Keep that in mind. So we are trying to find our footing, but I think it's very promising. So the mission of the GPay is really to bring countries and also a variety of experts, multi-stakeholders, and together to support the development of and the adoption of responsible AI. And it's grounded on different principles and kind of a target and that we give ourselves when we do our work. We mentioned here on the slides human rights, inclusion, diversity, gender equality, economic growth. So there's a lot of things that we consider when we do our work. And also something that's really important, and we try to connect with that when we work, is the SDGs. So that's one thing. So, I'm controlling the slides, it's true. Okay, too much power. Okay, so we started with 15 members. So as I mentioned, it was in 2020, but now we have more than, well, almost 30 members. We have 29 actually, and you can see on the slides the variety of countries that we have. So really try to push to be more inclusive and have more partners from the Global South. So that's something we're working on, but not there yet, but we have on our mind. And also just to give you a brief overview of the GPay structure. So there's a secretariat. It's the OECD that manage the secretariat, but also we have different kind of governing bodies, I would say. But the key element of this GPay is the fact that we have 4 working groups, and David mentioned one, which is data justice. But you have the responsible AI group, which I'm co-chairing with Raja Chatila from Paris. You have also the future of work and the one on innovation and commercializations. And these are supported by 2 centers of expertise. We have SEMIA in Montreal and INRIA in Paris, and we have people from the SEMIA in the room. So they do a very important work to support what we do. So that's the big picture, but just to give you a bit of more flesh about what we work on in the Responsible AI group. So it really is about trying to close that gap that you mentioned, Marc-Antoine, about principle and practice. So we try to work on really concrete project that activates these principles in really concrete impacts and roadmaps, and to guide the member states, because they are the ultimate, I would say, uptaker of what we do. So it really is about contributing to the responsible development and governance of human-centered AI systems, and we have different projects that we have decided to work on. Really briefly, there's one on the environment, so how we can use AI to really help to protect the environment. We call it RAISE. We have another one about gender diversity and equality. It's really recent. We have just started to work on this project. So this project is going to look at not only the GPay in itself, whether it's built or it's working properly to make sure that we are really respectful of that dimension, but also to look at the world more broadly, to pinpoint good practices in that area and try to make sure they are followed afterwards. There's another one about funding. It's new as well, so it's really starting. It's another one on developing sandboxes for responsible AI, especially for procurement that government could use. So it's to find best models around the world to help governments then to use this procurement. And then we have another one on scaling responsible AI solution to really see what obstacles they are currently existing in responsible AI projects, and the challenge that we have to really scale up this project and work on this to make sure that we overcome some of the obstacles and eventually have a better impact. And another one is about social media so to make sure that the recommender system are as respectful as possible of human rights. So, and another consideration to mention at the beginning. So that's pretty much kind of a broader review. I would also say that here you have kind of big picture of the Responsible AI group, who's part of that. So 36 experts and from 20 countries. We have also observer from the OECD. And so yeah, the geographical, stakeholder, and gender representation. So again, something that we are working on, but as a co-chair, that's something I take very deeply and seriously to make sure that we have broader diversity in that group and the GPA more broadly. So that's part of the first answer that you asked me. Then about the impact assessment, and David mentioned that at the beginning. They are working on that with the UNESCO recommendation. So I think about human rights, I just want to make a comment here, but I think, again, it's a very important conversation, and I think we need three things to make sure that we really build on what they mean and what they can have an impact and transforming a role actually in the AI world. And one is clarity. I think we need to better connect AI with human rights more frequently. And the point that David made is valid. Like, there are some, we can add more context to human rights and make sure that we really take into account the reality of different cultures. So that's something that we can do better. But still, we need to have more clarity about the fact that they are linked and need to better mobilize, I think, the language of human rights and the objectives and the mechanics of human rights regarding the opportunity, but also the risk that they present. And I would say that surprisingly, it's not a conversation that really we have frequently at the international level. So clarity on the fact that human rights and AI is linked, I think it's important. And AI can have a very positive impact on AI, on human rights as well. Just think I wasn't there, but this morning you mentioned health. So that's a positive example of how AI can have a positive impact on human rights, the right to health. So it can really speed up the drug discovery process. It can enlarge access to medicine and healthcare more broadly. So that's an example of positive impact and kind of conversation that we can have. But also, obviously, there are negative impacts on human rights, and we have to enlarge our scope, because often when we talk about human rights and AI, we speak about the impact on privacy and discrimination, so the right to equality, but it's way broader than that. So there can be negative impact on freedom of expression and freedom of association, for instance. So just think about when AI is used to censor speech, or also to triage people for employment opportunities. So there can be a negative impact there, but also it can have a negative impact on the right to life and security. Just think about harassment that can happen through AI systems. So that's the third thing, clarity about human rights and AI, and the conversation linked the two. But also, the second point would be to have to invest in education. So to invest in human rights literacy, so people are aware of what they are, what they do, how they work with ethics, for instance. I think it's a very interesting conversation to really increase the level of knowledge and awareness about human rights. I think it's an important part of the piece, and it's not, we're not there yet. And then it comes back to the question you asked, Marc-Antoine, is accountability towards human rights. And again, this importance to close the gap between principle and practice. And then David mentioned the impact assessment. It's something that I truly believe in. There are different ways to ensure accountability with human rights. So we have rapporteurs, I don't know if you're aware of that, but that's people that, explore and evaluate countries and whether they're respectful of their human rights. So that's one way. Courts, obviously, they manage claims that you can have regarding human rights. So it's another point. But I think the human rights impact assessment, so it's not ethical impact assessment, but I would focus specifically on human rights impact assessment. They can work on that preventive side, that ex-ante side that David mentioned. And these are really like processes that systematically evaluate and anticipate and mitigate the risk that that AI can have on human rights in specific cases. So, and they can take different forms, questionnaires, scoring, recommendation. And I just want to mention, and I'm ending my comments here, that there are an interesting example that we can take a look at when we try to find options to really give them real flesh and a real, I would say, forgot the word anyway. Concrete, to make them concrete, that's the word I was looking for. So there's the fundamental right an algorithm impact assessment that was developed in the Netherlands. So it provides guidance to AI developers to identify their system's impact on a wide range of fundamental rights. And also, not only did it do that, but it also provides several examples to measures that the AI developers can use to mitigate the risk of negative impacts of their AI. So at the end of the day, I think it's a good example to look at. We can adapt it to different realities, different contexts, and different projects. That's something we can do, but it's a good way to start to look at the Dutch model, I would say.
Thank you, Catherine, for this in-depth presentation.
It was.
So my last two questions are for Jason and David. Unfortunately, you have each about 5 minutes, 5-ish minutes. Okay, so as you know, IEEE has released in 2018 one of the first thorough reports on AI ethics. Toward the title was Toward Human Understandable, and Explainable AI. And because it was issued by the leading professional organization in engineering fields, we hoped for a very swift adoption of technical standards implementing the ethics by design approach. So, as director of the Canadian Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Ethical Design Lab at the University of Ottawa, and as you work on ethical engineering, how do you see standardization evolving in these fields of AI and robotics?
It's a great question. Thank you for that question. I was a part of the group of experts that was brought together, and it was a huge effort, many subcommittees to put that report together, and I would encourage everybody to go take a look at it. Because it led to the creation, so that document led to the creation of a number of standards, IEEE standards, and it's a complicated process that I don't totally understand myself. But the standards are out there to be adopted voluntarily, right? So immediately, I think the question answers itself almost, like why aren't the standards adopted? There's a lack of incentives for adopting these types of standards. That's one thing. I mean, the kind of cynical view would be to say that, well, companies don't want to adopt them. They see it as adding cost to their development cycles and so on and so forth. But I think there's a very instructive lesson that we learned in the autonomous vehicle space around the same time. What was it, 2016? When NHTSA in the US is the regulatory authority for safety of vehicles, they issued requirements that anyone developing autonomous vehicle systems had to write NHTSA a letter explaining what ethical considerations they had put into the development of those systems. That regulation, 2016, went out to comment, and the resounding response from industry was, this sounds like a good idea. We don't know what you mean. We don't know what it means to put ethical considerations into the development of our autonomous vehicle systems. And again, this goes back to the comments that I was making earlier. So the regulations, they play a fundamental role in signaling, in norm setting at a certain level. Standards can do the same thing, right? But in order to get these things adopted, there's this last mile problem where the people who you're asking to do the work need to really understand what that work means on a day-to-day basis. So if I walk in, so this dovetails into a lot of the research that I do. If I walk into my class on the first day of a course that I teach on ethical design of AI and robotics, and I ask my students, I need you to design AI so that it's not biased anymore. Most of them just don't know what you're talking about. They haven't been educated in the complexities of bias, and it's a deep and this is not a trivial problem. We as philosophers, as lawyers, we talk about bias, and we do write dissertations on different types of bias and what's acceptable and unacceptable. It's a very heady topic, and it's not realistic to expect that standards that ask standards or principles that are pushed out into the world, and where the expectation is for the practitioners, the technologists, to sort of just take them up and run with them. When they don't have the tools to do that translation work between what the principle means and what it means for like the AI that they're developing while they're writing code at their computer terminal, it's just not a realistic expectation. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, important work to do that translation, to make sure that like we're graduating more engineers, more computer scientists, to understand what it means to say, protect privacy, or to minimize harmful bias, or to uphold human rights in the code, or like to at least not violate human rights in the code that they're writing and things like this. This is a non-trivial problem, and I think that oftentimes we assume, because the words kind of just flow off of our tongues, like, oh, don't do these harms, that it will be very clear to people what that means in the day-to-day work when they're sitting in a room full of engineers doing the coding. So, I mean, my charitable answer is that standards are fundamental, and that we need to help develop these tools to really get the translation work done on that last mile, so that the code doesn't emerge that's problematic. And I think we see examples, even in ChatGPT. I see examples when I ask certain questions where OpenAI at least is flagging that they've made certain decisions in the code, the types of answers that you get that are in line with the types of principles that we're looking for them to adopt and run with. Of course, what is being done is insufficient, and the response from industry to just open the floodgates now and release these large language models to compete with OpenAI is problematic, and it's indicative of something else, maybe the lack of regulation, the lack of teeth. But I do want to say that that there is that last mile problem, and it's a significant problem that we need to address.
Thank you very much, Jason. I know it's late, but I have one last question for David, and I know it's late for you, especially David. And I have a horrible question for you, really horrible for you and the audience, but I will ask you anyway. So you're a philosopher with a deep interest in Wittgenstein's theory of language. And in the conversation on AI governance and AI ethics, we often use this metaphor of translation. You just mentioned translation into norms. So what does it mean to translate ethical principles into standards or regulatory norms? And sub-question, is there something like a common normative language, a moral grammar for ethics, law, and politics? And you have 2 minutes to address this question.
Really, that's great, and I will use my full 2 minutes for that reason. So yeah, I would say, so let me make the philosopher's move and try to flip the question on you, or at least to flip the options. And I was thinking when you were just talking about how actually we shouldn't start from thinking about ethics on the high and then trying to think about translating them into the real world. I want to take a more Levinasian standpoint and think about what he called le dire et le dit, right? This idea of the saying and the said. And if we think of it from a Levinasian standpoint, ethics is what happens in between people. It happens in the interactions that we have, in the way that we relate to one another through the technology and designing, developing, and deploying the technology. And it's always going to be relational. And in just that sense, I think that when we think about ethics in an age in which we can't reel in kind of universal values from some type of external rational universe, where we have to make the norms out of our own interactions and our own navigating the problems of life, we need to take a more procedural, more practice-based perspective on ethics. And for me, what that means in an innovation technology context is we need to think about creating the kind of necessary preconditions for meaningful deliberation and for respectful conversation, and that involves starting from procedural and communicative norms like consistency, coherence, impartiality, mutual respect, egalitarian reciprocity, sincerity, inclusivity, publicity. And for me, those type of procedural principles are first and foremost what we need to build out a responsible AI ecosystem. It's not about translating ethical principles into practice. It's about creating the right conditions to carry out the kind of common project of technology for me.
Thank you so much, David. I will pick mutual respect as the final word of this conversation. Merci beaucoup à toutes et à tous.